Ever wondered what happens when someone with no spouse and no kids decides to make their final wishes known? What if their last words were a prank from beyond the grave? Could a fortune be left to 70 complete strangers picked from a phone book? Or millions to a pack of dogs? Would someone really ask for their skin to be made into drums? And what if the greatest act of defiance was not writing a will at all, sparking a legal war for over 100 years? Get ready to discover the unbelievable true stories of spinsters and bachelors whose last wills and testaments were anything but ordinary. Number 10. Thomas Hollis V, the Republican philanthropist, who planned his own disappearance. Thomas Hollis, who lived from 1720 to 1774, was an Englishman of considerable means and even more considerable ideals. He never married, dedicating his life instead to the promotion of liberty and republican thought. Hollis inherited a significant fortune from his great-uncle, also named Thomas Hollis, a benefactor of Harvard College in the American colonies. This inheritance allowed him the freedom to pursue his intellectual and political passions without the need to earn a living in a conventional sense. He was a man of the Enlightenment, deeply influenced by writers like John Milton and Algernon Sidney, who championed rights and freedoms against tyrannical rule. Hollis's life was one of quiet but determined activism. He was not a public orator or a fire-faring politician. Instead, he used his wealth strategically to disseminate ideas. He would commission new editions of classic Republican texts, often embellishing them with symbolic designs he conceived himself: daggers, owls, and the cap of liberty. These books were then meticulously distributed to libraries and influential individuals across Britain, Europe, and especially the American colonies, which he saw as a fertile ground for the growth of liberty. He sent thousands of volumes to Harvard, carefully chosen to shape the minds of future leaders. His network of correspondence was vast, and his influence, though subtle, was pervasive. He believed in the power of education and knowledge to foster freedom. His personal life was notably ascetic for a man of his wealth. He dressed simply, ate moderately, and avoided the lavish social scene of 18th century London. This frugality was not born of miserliness, but from a desire to dedicate more resources to his philanthropic and political projects. He lived much of his later life on his estate at Corscombe, in Dorset, managing his affairs and his vast project of cultural seeding. He was, by all accounts, a private man, deliberate in his actions and deeply committed to his principles. This commitment extended to how he viewed his own death and legacy. The truly defiant part of Thomas Hollis's story comes with his will and the instructions for his burial. Drafted with the same precision he applied to his book distributions, his will laid out his wishes for the disposal of his property and, quite uniquely, his own remains. He died on New Year's Day, 1774, while out supervising workmen on his land. His end was as unceremonious as he seems to have wished his remembrance to be. In his will, Hollis directed that his body be interred on his own land at Corscombe. This itself was not entirely unusual for landowners of the period. However, the specific instructions were, he requested that his grave be 10 feet deep. Once his coffin was placed within, the grave was to be filled, and the field in which it was dug was to be immediately plowed over so that no trace of his burial site would remain. He explicitly forbade the erection of any monument or marker. He wished to disappear into the earth, leaving behind only his works and the ideas he had championed. This was a profound statement against the ostentatious funeral rites and grand memorials common among the wealthy of his era. It was a final act of humility, or perhaps a republican's ultimate rejection of any personal cult or aristocratic pomp. His will also meticulously detailed the distribution of his remaining estate. True to his life's work, Significant portions were directed towards continuing his mission. His friend Thomas Brand inherited his Dorset estate and changed his name to Thomas Brand Hollis, continuing some of Hollis's philanthropic activities. Collections of art and books were bequeathed to institutions where he believed they would serve the public good. There were no grand bequests to distant relatives he hardly knew, a common practice at the time. His legacies were purposeful, designed to perpetuate his ideals. The execution of his burial wishes was carried out as he instructed. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in one of his fields, and the plows soon turned the soil above him. For a man who had spent his life promoting enduring ideas, he seemed to want his physical presence to be entirely ephemeral. His defiance was not loud or angry. It was a quiet, philosophical statement embedded in his final arrangements. It was a testament to his belief that ideas, not individuals, were what truly mattered and endured. The act of deliberately obscuring his own resting place ensured that he would be remembered for his intellectual contributions, for the books he spread and the liberties he championed, rather than for a stone monument in a churchyard. His legacy was to be found in libraries and in the minds of men, not in a specific plot of English soil. Number 9. William Jennens, the miser whose lack of a will led to a century of chaos. William Jennens, who lived from 1701 to 1798, was known as William the Rich, and later, more famously, as the Miser of Acton. He was a lifelong bachelor who, through a combination of inheritance, shrewd investments, and extreme frugality, became the wealthiest commoner in England by the time of his death. His fortune was estimated at over £2 million sterling, an almost unimaginable sum in the late 18th century, equivalent to billions in today's terms. He owned vast estates in Suffolk and London, including property in what is now bustling Oxford Street. Jennens lived a life of remarkable parsimony. Despite his immense wealth, his personal expenditure was minimal. He resided in a large, sparsely furnished house in Grosvenor Square, London, attended by few servants whom he reportedly treated poorly and paid little. Stories abounded of his eccentric habits, of him sifting through ashes for unburned cinders, of his clothes being threadbare, and of his preference for an unlit house to save on candles. He was said to avoid visitors, fearing they might expect hospitality or worse, financial assistance. He had a deep suspicion of lawyers and was notoriously reluctant to spend money on legal advice, a fact that would prove supremely ironic after his death. His defiance in the context of last wills was not in writing an eccentric one, but in failing to write a valid one at all. Despite his advanced age and staggering fortune, he had, at one point, instructed his solicitor to prepare a will. However, he reportedly refused to pay the standard fee for the solicitor to attend him at his country estate in Acton, Suffolk, to witness its signing. He also allegedly quibbled over the cost of a second witness. Consequently, when he died at the age of 97 in his unheated London mansion, the will remained unsigned. He died intestate. The moment William Jennens breathed his last without a legally executed will, one of the most complex and protracted legal battles in British history was set in motion. With no direct heirs like children or a spouse, the question of who was entitled to his colossal fortune became a magnet for claimants from all corners of the country and even abroad. Hundreds, possibly thousands of individuals emerged, asserting some distant familial connection to the deceased miser. Courts were inundated with claims, counterclaims, and genealogical charts of dubious authenticity. The legal proceedings, famously known as the Jennens case, or Jarndyce and Jarndyce, as it is widely believed to have inspired Charles Dickens in his novel Bleak House, dragged on for over a century. Generations of lawyers profited from the seemingly endless litigation. The estate itself, vast as it was, began to dwindle under the weight of legal fees and administrative costs. Courts had to meticulously examine lineage tracing family trees back through centuries. A Herculean task in an era before centralized record-keeping was comprehensive. The initial beneficiaries, recognized by the courts, were distant cousins. His closest living relatives were Lady Mary Andover, his aunt, and William Lygon, later Earl Beauchamp, a great-great-grandson of Jennens' grandfather. However, the complexity arose because English inheritance law at the time, particularly for real estate versus personal property, was intricate. Different rules applied to different types of assets, and tracing the correct lines of descent for each was a nightmare. Case became a byword for legal delay, and the frustrating, often ruinous nature of chancery court proceedings. Over the decades, the narrative of the Jennens inheritance became legendary. Families passed down stories of their supposed right to a share of the fortune, sometimes spending their own limited resources in pursuit of this elusive wealth. The case saw numerous appeals and rehearings. By the time the legal battles finally subsided well into the 21st century, a significant portion of the original fortune had been consumed by the process of trying to distribute it. The final resolution, if one could even call it that after so much time and expense, saw the remaining assets distributed among those few claimants who could definitively prove their lineage according to the arcane laws of succession. The last related case concerning the estate was reportedly heard as late as 1915, some 117 years after Jennens's death. William Jennens' failure to formalize his testamentary wishes, perhaps out of his characteristic aversion to spending money or his distrust of legal professionals, resulted in a legacy of contention and waste. His life was one of extreme accumulation and minimal enjoyment. His death triggered a feeding frenzy that tokayed the worst aspects of legal entanglement and human greed. The ultimate irony was that this man, who hoarded every penny, inadvertently caused the expenditure of millions from his own estate, simply because he did not complete the one legal document that could have dictated its orderly succession. His defiance was unintentional, a product of his miserly character, but its consequences were monumental. Number 8. Solomon Sanborn, the tanner, who willed his body to science and his hides to drums. Solomon Sanborn was a tanner by trade, living in Medford, Massachusetts during the 19th century. Born around 1790, he remained a bachelor throughout his life and was known in his community as a somewhat eccentric, though respected individual. He passed away in October 1871, leaving behind a will that raised more than a few eyebrows and secured his place in the annals of unusual last wishes. Sanborn's will was dated May 18, 1869, and it contained several provisions that were distinctly unconventional for his time. In an era when the idea of bodily dissection was still met with considerable public aversion and religious concern, Sanborn made a remarkably forward-thinking, or perhaps simply unsentimental bequest. He directed in his will that his body should be given to physicians for dissection. His specific instruction was that medical professionals could use his remains for scientific study and advancement. There was a condition attached. After they had satisfied their scientific curiosity upon it, they were to ensure his body was decently buried. This was a significant departure from the common desire for a traditional Christian burial, untouched by the surgeon's knife, and it reflected a practical, perhaps even progressive, mindset. For many in the mid-19th century, such a request would have been seen as shocking, even sacrilegious. But the anatomical gift was not the only peculiar provision in Solomon Sanborn's testament. As a tanner, Sanborn had accumulated a stock of hides and skins, the raw materials of his trade. He had specific plans for these as well. His will detailed that his hides and skins were to be given to Michael Murray, a drum manufacturer based in Boston. Murray was instructed to craft these materials into 2 drumheads. These were not to be just any drums. Sanborn specified their recipients and intended uses. 1 drum, fitted with a head made from his tanning stock, was to be presented to his friend William B. Lawrence of Medford. This drum was to be used by him on all proper occasions. The second drum was designated for the use of the town of Medford. It was to be given into the charge of the selectmen of the town and played by the regular town drummer on all proper occasions of parade, etc. It is important to note that a common misinterpretation of Sanborn's will suggests he wanted his own skin used for the drums. The actual text of the will refers to his stock of animal hides and skins from his tannery business. While less macabre than the popular myth, the request to turn his professional leavings into musical instruments for specific civic and personal use was still highly idiosyncratic. The remainder of Sanborn's estate, after these and other minor bequests, was to be divided. Half was to go to the town of Medford for the benefit of its poor, and the other half to the home for aged men in Boston. These charitable donations showed a philanthropic side to the eccentric tanner. Publication of Sanborn's will in newspapers like the Boston Daily Globe in October 1871 caused a stir. The details were unusual enough to be newsworthy, particularly the donation of his body to science and the bespoke drums. Provided a glimpse into the mind of a man who clearly thought differently from many of his contemporaries. His wishes regarding his physical remains challenged societal norms about death and the sanctity of the body. His instructions for his hides demonstrated a quirky desire to leave a very personal and utilitarian legacy, connecting his life's work as a tanner to the civic and social life of his community through the sound of drums. The town of Medford did indeed receive a drum, as stipulated. For some time, it was used as Sanborn had wished. The fate of his body, whether it was indeed used for medical dissection as per his will, is less clearly documented in readily available public records, but the intent itself was a mark of his unusual character. Solomon Sanborn, the bachelor tanner, ensured he would not be easily forgotten, not through a grand monument, but through practical anatomical study and the rhythmic beat of drums crafted from the fruits of his labor. His will was a final, defiant act of individuality. Number 7. Henry Cavendish, the reclusive genius who weighed the world and left a fortune. Henry Cavendish, who lived from 1731 to 1810, was one of the most brilliant and eccentric scientists in history. A lifelong bachelor, he was pathologically shy and reclusive, dedicating his existence almost entirely to scientific investigation. Born into a wealthy, aristocratic family, he was the grandson of both the Duke of Devonshire and the Duke of Kent, Cavendish, inherited a vast fortune, making him one of the richest men in Britain. Yet he lived a life of extreme simplicity, almost austerity, his vast resources channeled primarily into his scientific pursuits. Cavendish's contributions to science were monumental. He discovered hydrogen, which he called inflammable air, and was the first to recognize it as a distinct element. He accurately determined the composition of water. He measured the density of the Earth in his famous Cavendish experiment, essentially weighing the world, a feat of extraordinary experimental precision for his time. He also anticipated many later discoveries in electricity, including Ohm's law and Coulomb's law, though much of this work remained unpublished during his lifetime due to his extreme aversion to communicating his findings. He was driven by an insatiable curiosity, not by a desire for fame or recognition. His reclusiveness was legendary. He avoided social interaction whenever possible, especially with women. If a female servant crossed his path, she risked dismissal. He communicated with his housekeepers primarily through notes. He would order his dinner by leaving a note on the hall table. He had a private staircase built in his London house in Clapham Common to avoid encountering his servants. When he attended meetings of the Royal Society, of which he was a fellow, he would often hover near the doorway, slipping away if anyone approached him too directly or attempted to engage him in conversation beyond scientific matters. His clothes were old-fashioned, typically a faded violet suit, and he wore a tricorn hat. Any change in his routine caused him distress. Given his immense wealth and solitary nature, the disposition of his estate upon his death was a matter of considerable interest. Cavendish died in February 1810, at the age of 78. He had never married and had no children. His will, unlike his scientific papers, which were often kept private, had to deal with the very public matter of his fortune, which was estimated to be around £1.175 million sterling at the time of his death, an astronomical sum. The defiance in Cavendish's will was not in bizarre requests or vengeful disinheritances. Rather, it lay in its straightforwardness and its reflection of his detached nature, even concerning his own vast wealth. He did not use his will as an instrument of social engineering or as a platform for personal statements, other than to distribute his property according to familial lines, despite his limited interaction with many of these relatives. The principal beneficiary of his will was Lord George Augustus Henry Cavendish, who later became the Earl of Burlington. Lord George was Henry Cavendish's first cousin, once removed, and shared his scientific interests to some extent. He inherited the bulk of the fortune, approximately £700,000, along with Cavendish's primary residence at Clapham and other properties. Other relatives also received substantial legacies. For example, his cousin Frederick Cavendish received £50,000. Several other Cavendish family members received sums ranging from £10,000 to £20,000. Even his bankers received £5,000 each. What is perhaps most telling is what was not in the will. There were no significant bequests to scientific institutions or for the explicit furtherance of science, beyond the expectation that his scientific library and apparatus would be preserved by his heirs. This might seem surprising for a man so devoted to research. However, it was consistent with his character. He pursued science for its own sake, not for public acclaim or institutional legacy in that manner. His legacy was his discoveries, whether published or not. The distribution of his worldly goods seemed to be a practical matter. He addressed with logical, if impersonal, adherence to family ties, as was conventional for his class, despite his unconventional life. The vast sums distributed made his relatives, many of whom he had likely interacted with minimally, exceedingly wealthy. The fortune accumulated through generations and augmented by Cavendish's own frugal living and astute, or perhaps passively managed, investments, thus flowed back into the broader Cavendish clan. There were no reports of major disputes or legal challenges to his will. It was clear and its provisions relatively conventional in terms of beneficiary selection for a man of his standing, without direct heirs. Henry Cavendish's defiance was in his life, his utter dedication to science over societal expectation, his extreme shyness that bordered on a disorder, and his indifference to the trappings of his immense wealth. His will, in its uneccentric distribution to relatives, was perhaps a final, quiet act of conformity from a man who conformed to almost nothing else. Perhaps it was simply the most logical and least troublesome way for this intensely private man to divest himself of a fortune he never seemed to particularly want or need for personal gratification. His true testament was in the notebooks, filled with ground-draining experiments and calculations, a legacy that would only be fully appreciated long after his death, when James Clerk Maxwell edited and published his electrical papers in 18... Number 6. George Bernard Shaw, the iconoclast who willed a fortune to remake the alphabet. George Bernard Shaw, the celebrated Irish playwright, critic, and political activist, lived from 1856 to 1950. Awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1925, Shaw was a towering figure of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, renowned for his sharp wit, socialist views, and relentless challenging of conventional wisdom. Though he married Charlotte Payne Townsend in 1898, when he was 42, they had no children, and his will reflected his lifelong, often eccentric passions rather than typical familial bequests, especially as Charlotte predeceased him in 1943. Shaw remained a bachelor for a significant portion of his formative and productive years, developing many of the iconoclastic ideas that would later feature in his unique testamentary plans. Shaw was a man of strong opinions and a fervent advocate for reform in many areas, from politics and economics to vegetarianism and dress. One of his most enduring, and arguably most quixotic, campaigns was for the reform of the English alphabet. He believed that the conventional Latin alphabet was an inefficient and illogical tool for representing the sounds of spoken English. He argued that it wasted time, effort, and resources in writing, printing, and teaching. He envisioned a new phonetic alphabet, which he called the proposed English alphabet, or Shavian alphabet, that would have at least 40 letters, each corresponding to a single distinct sound. This, he believed, would simplify spelling, make learning to read easier, and save millions in printing costs. His commitment to this cause was so profound that he made it a central feature of his last will and testament. When Shaw died in November 1950, at the age of 94, his will revealed detailed instructions and a substantial portion of his considerable estate dedicated to the development and promotion of this new alphabet. The will, a lengthy and complex document, specified that a trust be established for this purpose. Public trustee was tasked with overseeing the project. The specific instructions in the will were quite remarkable. Shaw directed his trustee to ascertain how much time and money could be saved by the substitution of his proposed alphabet for the traditional one. He then instructed that his play Androcles and the Lion be transliterated and published in this new alphabet, alongside a version in the conventional alphabet, and distributed to public libraries across the English-speaking world. The will also provided for the design of the new letter forms. The income from his residual estate, which was substantial due to the ongoing royalties from his highly successful plays like Pygmalion, which later became the musical My Fair Lady, St. Joan, and Man and Superman, was to fund this endeavor for a period of 21 years after his death. This bequest was quintessentially Shavian, bold, unconventional, and aimed at a radical, logical, in his view, reform of a fundamental aspect of daily life. It was defiant in its sheer ambition and its challenge to something as deeply entrenched as the English alphabet. Many viewed it as impractical, a folly of a brilliant but eccentric old man. Trustees faced considerable difficulty in interpreting and implementing Shaw's wishes. There were questions about the feasibility of the project and whether it constituted a valid charitable trust. The will was indeed contested. The British Museum and the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, who were named as residuary legatees to receive the funds if the alphabet project failed, or after the 21-year period, challenged the validity of the trust for the alphabet reform. They argued that the trust was not for a charitable purpose as legally defined, and that its objects were too uncertain. Case went to court. In 1957, the High Court ruled that the trust for the alphabet was invalid because its purpose was not strictly charitable, as it aimed to increase knowledge but not necessarily through teaching or education in the established sense, and its benefits were too uncertain. However, a compromise was reached out of court. An ex gratia sum of £8,300 was allocated for the development of the Shavian alphabet. This allowed for the design of the alphabet by Ronald Kingsley Read, who had been corresponding with Shaw on the subject. Read's design, a 48-letter phonetic alphabet, was finalized. As Shaw had wished, Androcles and the Lion was published in a dual alphabet edition in 1962. Several other texts were also produced in Shavian. After the 21-year period stipulated in the will for the Alphabet Trust, the remaining funds from Shaw's estate, which had grown considerably, were distributed to the residuary legatees, the British Museum, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, and the National Gallery of Ireland. While the Shavian alphabet never achieved widespread adoption or replaced the traditional English alphabet as Shaw had hoped, his will ensured that his idiosyncratic project was given a serious, if limited, trial. It remains a fascinating example of a highly intellectual and individualistic attempt to direct a posthumous legacy towards a deeply personal and radical vision of reform. Shaw's final act was a testament to his unwavering belief in the power of rational change, even when faced with the inertia of centuries of tradition. Number 5. Anne Scheiber, the frugal auditor who secretly amassed millions for women's futures. Anne Scheiber was, by all outward appearances, an unremarkable woman who lived a remarkably frugal life. Born in 1893 in New York, she worked for many years as an auditor for the Internal Revenue Service, the United States tax agency. She retired in 1944. She never married and lived alone in a small, rent-stabilized studio apartment in Manhattan. She was known for her modest, even shabby clothing and her penny-pinching habits. Few, if any, suspected the secret she harbored. Through astute and patient investment in the stock market over 5 decades, Anne Scheiber had amassed a fortune. Scheiber's life was characterized by solitude and a deep sense of having been undervalued and discriminated against, particularly as a woman in the professional world. She reportedly felt that her career at the IRS had been stifled due to her gender and her Jewish background. This sense of injustice seems to have fueled a quiet determination to succeed on her own terms, albeit privately. After retiring with a pension of around $3,100 United States dollars a year, she took her modest savings, reportedly about 5,000 United States dollars, and began investing. Over the next 51 years, from her retirement until her death in 1995, at the age of 101, Scheiber demonstrated an extraordinary talent for stock picking. She focused on well-known blue-chip companies and held on to her investments for the long term, allowing dividends to compound and capital to grow. She lived incredibly sparingly, reportedly never buying new furniture, wearing old clothes, and walking to save bus fare whenever possible. She attended shareholder meetings to get free food and to scrutinize company management. Her only apparent indulgence was her investments. She meticulously managed her portfolio, which eventually included shares in companies like Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Ploughed, and Paramount. When Anne Scheiber died in January 1995, the world was stunned to learn the scale of her hidden wealth. Her estate was valued at an astonishing 22 million United States dollars. She had no close relatives to inherit this fortune. Her will, therefore, became a document of immense public interest, revealing where this secretly accumulated wealth would go. The defiant and inspiring aspect of Anne Scheiber's will was her decision to leave almost her entire fortune to Yeshiva University, a private research university in New York City with Jewish roots. But her bequest came with specific stipulations reflecting her own life experiences and values. She directed that the 22 million United States dollars be used to provide scholarships and financial aid specifically for female students at Yeshiva University's Stern College for Women and its Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Her motivation, as explained by her lawyer and executor, Benjamin Clark, was rooted in her belief that women, like herself, faced significant obstacles in achieving their educational and professional goals. Having experienced discrimination, she wanted to empower other women to overcome similar challenges. She chose Yeshiva University because, although she was not Orthodox herself, she respected its educational mission and perhaps felt a cultural connection. She had never attended Yeshiva University, nor had any publicly known prior connection to it. The university itself was surprised and immensely grateful for the unexpected windfall. The bequest was Ba for Yeshiva University. It significantly boosted the endowment for scholarships for women. Anne Scheiber, the woman who had lived in obscurity and poverty by choice, became a posthumous champion of female education. Her story was a powerful testament to the impact of disciplined investing and the potential for a single individual, even one of modest beginnings and a quiet life, to make a profound difference. Her will was not vengeful or eccentric in a frivolous way. Its defiance lay in its quiet power, its subversion of expectations about who accumulates wealth and for what purpose. She had lived a life constrained by perceived limitations, yet she had masterminded a financial success that allowed her to posthumously break down barriers for generations of women she would never meet. Her legacy was not in buildings or monuments bearing her name, but in the educational opportunities she created. Anne Scheiber's final act ensured that her life, lived largely in the shadows, would cast a long and brilliant light on the future of countless young women. It was a carefully planned, deeply personal, and ultimately monumental act of philanthropy. Number 4. Eleanor E. Ritchie, the Quaker Oats heiress, who left millions to her 150 dogs. Eleanor E. Ritchie was an heiress to the Quaker Oats Company fortune, a significant American food conglomerate. Born in 1910, she was the granddaughter of the company's founder. Despite her wealthy background, Ritchie lived a relatively secluded life on her 180-acre ranch in Florida. She never married and was known for her deep affection for animals, particularly dogs. Over the years, she had rescued and cared for a vast number of stray and unwanted dogs, and by the time of her death, her canine family had grown to an extraordinary size. Ritchie passed away in 1968 at the age of 58. When her will was read, it caused a sensation. She had bequeathed her entire fortune, estimated at the time to be around $4.5 million United States dollars. Some reports later suggested it grew to as much as $14 million United States dollars with asset growth, to her dogs. At the time of her death, there were approximately 150 dogs living on her ranch. This was not a token amount for their care. It was the entirety of her substantial estate, designated for their lifelong well-being. The will stipulated that the money was to be placed in a trust fund managed by trustees solely for the care and maintenance of her beloved canine companions. The instructions were detailed. The dogs were to continue living at her ranch, receive proper food, veterinary care, and affection. They were not to be sold or given away, unless it was to a good home that could be thoroughly vetted, and even then, only if it was in the dog's best interest. The will essentially ensured that her dogs would continue to live in the manner to which they had become accustomed for the rest of their natural lives. This bequest was highly unusual and attracted widespread media attention. The idea of millions of dollars being left to animals while humans struggled with poverty sparked public debate. Some saw it as an act of profound compassion from a dedicated animal lover. Others viewed it as an eccentric, even irresponsible use of such a vast fortune. Animal welfare organizations, however, generally lauded the intent, even if the scale was unprecedented. Legally, pets cannot directly inherit money, as they are considered property. Therefore, such bequests are typically structured as trusts, where human trustees are responsible for using the funds for the benefit of the animals. Eleanor Ritchie's will was set up in this manner. However, the sheer number of dogs and the amount of money involved made it a complex undertaking. As might be expected, with such a large and unusual bequest, there were legal challenges. Ritchie had two sisters who contested the will. They argued that Eleanor was not of sound mind when she made the will, or that she had been unduly influenced. Such claims are common when large estates are left in unconventional ways. The legal battle over the Ritchie estate lasted for several years. Ultimately, the courts upheld the will, affirming Eleanor Ritchie's right to dispose of her property as she saw fit, even if her chosen beneficiaries were four-legged. A settlement was eventually reached, however, which reportedly gave a portion of the estate to the human relatives while still ensuring substantial funds remained for the dog's care. The trust continued to operate for many years after Ritchie's death. As the dogs aged and passed away, the number of beneficiaries naturally dwindled. The last of Eleanor Ritchie's original 150 dogs, a mongrel named Musketeer, died in 1984, 16 years after his benefactor. With the passing of the last dog, the terms of the trust dictated what would happen to the remaining funds. The residual money, which by then had reportedly grown to around $12 million due to investments, was directed to Auburn University's School of Veterinary Medicine in Alabama. This part of the will specified that the funds should be used for research into canine diseases and care. This ensured that Eleanor Ritchie's love for dogs would have a lasting impact, benefiting countless other animals long after her own pets were gone. The Ritchie Endowment at Auburn has since supported significant research and advancements in veterinary science. Eleanor Ritchie's will was a defiant statement of her priorities. In a world that often valued human concerns far above animal welfare, she used her considerable wealth to ensure the lifelong comfort of her animal companions and ultimately to advance the cause of canine health on a much broader scale. Her legacy is a testament to an extraordinary love for dogs and a willingness to defy societal expectations in her final act of generosity. Number 3. Luis Carlos de Noronha Cabral de Camara, the aristocrat who made 70 strangers rich. Luis Carlos de Noronha Cabral de Camara was a Portuguese aristocrat with a lineage tracing back to the royal houses of Portugal. Born in 1947, he lived a life of quiet privilege, largely unknown to the wider public. He was a bachelor, childless, and by most accounts somewhat solitary. He owned property, including a 12-room apartment in Lisbon, a house in the north of Portugal, a car, and had some money in investments. While not fabulously wealthy by international standards, he was comfortably well off. Luis Carlos passed away in 2007 at the age of 60. He had no close family members to inherit his estate. His parents had predeceased him, and he had no siblings, spouse, or children. In such situations, an estate might typically go to more distant relatives or lacking those to the state. However, Luis Carlos had made a will 13 years prior to his death, a will that contained a most unexpected and defiant provision. The will, properly notarized and legally sound, stipulated that his entire fortune was to be divided equally among 70 individuals, chosen completely at random, from the Lisbon telephone directory. This was not a prank. It was his serious and legally binding last wish. He had apparently walked into a notary's office in Lisbon one day in 1994, accompanied by 2 witnesses as required by Portuguese law, and dictated this unusual instruction. The notary, at the time, Aníbal Castro Bagoro, reportedly questioned the testator about his bizarre request, but Luis Carlos simply stated that he did not want his assets to go to the state, and he had no one else he wished to leave them to. Upon his death and the opening of his will, the executors faced an unprecedented task: how to fairly and legally select 70 random names from a phone book. The process itself had to be transparent and verifiable to prevent any accusations of favoritism or fraud. A court official, in the presence of 2 judges, was tasked with performing the selection. They opened a copy of the Lisbon phone directory, the residential listings at random pages, and then, again at random, pointed to names on those pages until 70 individuals had been identified. chosen 70 people were then contacted by court officials and informed of their unexpected inheritance. As one might imagine, the reactions ranged from disbelief and suspicion to outright joy. Many initially thought it was a hoax or a scam. Why would a complete stranger, an aristocrat no less, leave them money? Each of the 70 beneficiaries was set to receive a share of Luis Carlos's assets, which included the proceeds from the sale of his apartment, his car, his motorcycle, and his financial investments. The amounts varied as the estate was liquidated, but each share was reported to be several thousand euros, a significant sum for many ordinary people. Some reports indicated each received around 6,500 euros, while others mentioned figures closer to what a year's salary might be for some. The story quickly gained international media attention. It was a modern-day fairy tale, a testament to an act of almost whimsical posthumous generosity. Explanations for Luis Carlos's decision were sparse, as he had been a private man. Friends described him as intelligent and possessing a good sense of humor, but also somewhat lonely. Perhaps this was his way of making a final, memorable connection with the world, or a social commentary on wealth and inheritance. Or maybe it was simply a grand, eccentric gesture to avoid his money being absorbed by the government. He had apparently told friends he did not like the state and did not want it to benefit from his death. There were no conditions attached to the bequests for the 70 strangers. They were free to use the money as they wished. The act was purely an arbitrary distribution of wealth, defying traditional notions of inheritance based on kinship, friendship, or service. It was a final act of autonomy from a man who, having no direct heirs, chose to disperse his legacy in the most unconventional and democratic way imaginable by a lottery of sorts, conducted via the pages of a common phone book. Luis Carlos de Noronha Cabral da Camara, the reclusive aristocrat, ensured his death would bring an unexpected boon to dozens of ordinary people, a defiant and unforgettable caprice from beyond the grave. Number 2. Jeremy Bentham, the philosopher who willed his body to be dissected and displayed. Jeremy Bentham, who lived from 1748 to 1832, was a highly influential English philosopher, jurist, and social reformer. He is widely regarded as the founder of modern utilitarianism, the ethical theory that promotes actions that maximize happiness and well-being for the greatest number of people. A lifelong bachelor, Bentham was a prolific writer and thinker, advocating for reforms in law, prisons, education, and government. He was also known for his eccentricities, which extended to his very specific and radical plans for his own remains after his death. Bentham was a strong proponent of the scientific use of deceased human bodies for anatomical study. In his era, there was a severe shortage of cadavers for medical schools, leading to the grisly practice of body snatching. Bentham believed that individuals should voluntarily donate their bodies to science, to advance medical knowledge, and to demystify death. He saw the traditional, elaborate, and costly funeral practices as mummery and a waste of resources. He wanted his own death to serve a practical, educational purpose, consistent with his utilitarian principles. His will, written years before his death, contained detailed instructions for the fate of his body. First, he directed that his body should be publicly dissected by his friend, Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith, a physician and fellow reformer. This dissection was not just for private medical study. Bentham envisioned it as a public lecture and demonstration, a final act of service to science and education. He hoped his example would encourage others to donate their bodies, thereby alleviating the need for illegal methods of obtaining cadavers. Public dissection took place as planned 3 days after Bentham's death, on June 6, 1832. Dr. Southwood Smith delivered a lecture over Bentham's remains to an audience of medical students, intellectuals, and reformers at the Webb Street School of Anatomy and Medicine in London. It was a controversial event, challenging societal taboos surrounding death and the handling of human remains. But it was precisely what Bentham had intended. However, Bentham's instructions did not end with the dissection. He further directed that his skeleton be preserved, articulated, reassembled, and dressed in his own clothes. This figure, which he called an autoicon, was then to be seated in a chair in the attitude in which I am sitting when engaged in thought and writing. He even specified that his preserved head should be placed upon the skeleton. The autoicon was to be housed in a wooden cabinet and regularly brought out to preside in a symbolic way at meetings of his followers, or when his friends gathered. He humorously suggested that if his friends met, "It will be," said Bentham is there. Dr. Southwood Smith undertook the task of creating the autoicon. The skeleton was indeed dressed in Bentham's own black suit, stuffed with hay and fitted with his hat and cane. However, the attempt to preserve Bentham's actual head according to his instructions, using a desiccation method employed by the Maori people of New Zealand, was not entirely successful. The head ended up looking rather grotesque and unsuitable for display. Consequently, a wax replica of Bentham's head, complete with his own hair, was created and placed on the autoicon. The real mummified head was initially placed between the autoicon's feet and later stored separately for better preservation. The autoicon was kept by Dr. Southwood Smith for many years. In 1850, it was presented to University College London, UK, an institution Bentham had spiritually influenced with his educational reform ideas, though he played no direct part in its founding. UK had embraced secular education and was open to students of all religions, aligning with Bentham's progressive views. To this day, Jeremy Bentham's autoicon remains at OK, housed in a special glass-fronted wooden cabinet in the south cloisters of the main building. It is regularly inspected and maintained. By tradition, the autoicon is sometimes wheeled into meetings of the college council, where Bentham is recorded in the minutes as present but not voting. On other special occasions, it has also made appearances. His actual mummified head, after a period of being displayed with the autoicon and then being subjected to student pranks, is now stored securely in the university's archives for conservation reasons. Jeremy Bentham's will was a radical and defiant act, perfectly embodying his philosophical principles and his unconventional personality. He transformed his own death into a lasting statement about rationality, scientific progress, and the rejection of superstition. His autoicon is not just a curious relic, it is a potent symbol of his enduring legacy and his lifelong commitment to utilitarian ideals, ensuring that he remains a tangible if silent presence in the institution that champions many of the values he held dear. It is arguably one of the most bizarre and intellectually consistent last wishes ever executed. Number 1. Charles Vance Millar, the lawyer, whose will sparked a baby-making derby. Charles Vance Millar was a prominent Canadian lawyer and financier who lived from 1853 to 1926. Born in Aylmer, Ontario, he established a successful legal practice in Toronto and became known for his shrewd investments, particularly in mining and brewing companies, including a stake in the O'Keefe Brewery. Millar never married and had no children. He was known as a lover of practical jokes and possessed a mischievous sense of humor, which extended even to his final testamentary dispositions. His will, opened after his death on Halloween, October 31, 1926, would unleash one of the most extraordinary and talked-about social competitions in Canadian history, the Great Toronto Stork Derby. Millar's will was a masterpiece of playful provocation and social commentary, filled with bequests designed to tweak the noses of authority figures and challenge societal norms. For instance, he left shares in his O'Keefe Brewery, a Catholic-owned company, to a group of prominent Protestant ministers who were outspoken prohibitionists, seemingly to put them in an awkward moral and financial position. He bequeathed shares in a jockey club to known opponents of horse racing. These were classic Miller pranks, designed to cause amusement and perhaps a little discomfort. However, the most famous and defiant clause in his will was Clause 9. This clause stipulated that the entirety of his residual estate, which was quite substantial, valued at over 500,000 Canadian dollars at the time, equivalent to many millions today, was to be converted into cash 10 years after his death. This sum was then to be given to the Toronto mother, who in that 10-year period had given birth to the most children. The will specified that evidence of births had to be duly registered according to the laws of Ontario, and that illegitimate children would not count unless the mother subsequently married the father of those children. This bequest immediately sparked a firestorm of controversy and public fascination. The Stork Derby, as it was quickly dubbed by the press, was seen by some as an outrageous and irresponsible incitement to reckless procreation, particularly during the difficult years of the Great Depression, which began in 1929, just 3 years into the contest period. Others saw it as a harmless, if eccentric, gesture. Religious leaders, social reformers, and medical professionals weighed in with opinions ranging from condemnation to bemused tolerance. The Ontario government even attempted to have the will invalidated and the money directed to the University of Toronto, arguing that the clause was contrary to public policy. However, after legal challenges and much debate, the Supreme Court of Canada ultimately upheld the validity of Millar's will in 1936. The race was on. For 10 years, from 1926 to 1936, families across Toronto, and some from further afield, testing the geographical limits of the will's interpretation, competed, whether intentionally or not, for the grand prize. The media avidly followed the leading contenders, publishing updates on family sizes and speculating on who might win. It became a human interest story of epic proportions, highlighting the struggles and hopes of ordinary families during a period of severe economic hardship. For many impoverished families, the prospect of winning Millar's fortune was a powerful incentive. When the 10-year period concluded on October 31, 1936, the executors of Millar's estate faced the daunting task of verifying claims and determining the winners. Numerous families came forward. After careful scrutiny of birth records and legal interpretations of the will's conditions, for example, what constituted a mother residing in Toronto, several families were found to be in close contention. Ultimately, the prize money, which had grown to around 750,000 Canadian dollars to investments, was divided among 4 mothers who had each given birth to 9 children legitimately registered in Toronto during the specified decade. These women were Annie Catherine Smith, Kathleen Ellen Nagel, Lucy Alice Timlek, and Isabel Mary McLean. Each received approximately 125,000 Canadian dollars, a life-changing sum at the time. 2 other mothers, who had also produced large families, received smaller consolation payments of 12,500 Canadian dollars each, as some of their children were stillborn or did not fully meet all the criteria in a way that allowed them to tie for the main prize. Charles Vance Millar's Stork Derby remains one of history's most audacious and talked about testamentary pranks. It was a defiant gesture that used his wealth to create a decade-long social experiment, blurring the lines between philanthropy, social engineering, and pure mischief. Whether he intended to make a serious statement about population, to mock societal conventions, or simply to have a grand laugh from beyond the grave, his will succeeded in capturing the public imagination and leaving an unforgettable if controversial legacy. He ensured his name would be remembered not just as a successful lawyer, but as the architect of a most unusual human race.